That's fine.
It's very distracting.
Huh?
It's very distracting.
This is distracting. It's fine. Just stop looking at yourself.
Do you not find it distracting to be able to see yourself?
No, I'm really vain. So, no.
That's why it's distracting.
Oh, no, I don't. I'm not like a goldfish or a magpie. I don't get distracted from that perspective. But like,
I have ADHD. I am literally like a magpie. Ooh,
no,
shiny.
I'm just like, okay, everything's still fine.
Welcome to In Bits, the podcast that deconstructs our digital lives. I'm Nicola.
And I'm Liam, and we're both lecturers in IDT, in psychology and cyber psychology. So, Nicola, what are you in bits about?
It's actually, so Cassidy, what are you in bits about this week? Because we have a guest on the show to talk about cyberstalking, which I'm also in bits about. Dr. Cassidy Weeks, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, hi. So I am a lecturer in forensic psychology at the University of Derby, and I recently completed my PhD in forensic psychology down at the University of Kent. Through that PhD, I was researching the perpetration and victimization of cyberstalking, and I have general interests in the perpetration of other online harms. My research focused on the types, the methods of cyberstalking that are being perpetrated, some of the responses of victims, the way that we categorize perpetrators of cyberstalking, and then I also looked at criminal justice responses within England and Wales currently as well.
Excellent. So we saw Cassidy speak at the BPS conference last summer and really, really wanted to get her to come on the podcast because it's such an interesting area. And we did an episode previously on catfishing, which I think has a lot in common, and there's a lot of like crossover between that and cyberstalking. But cyberstalking is very much its own thing, and there is some really good research on it.
I think you're doing Cassidy a disservice. Long before we were in Cassidy's talk, we were flicking through the program at the conference, and I was like, we absolutely have to go to this. This sounds really, really interesting. And then we were sat there for like 2 or 3 minutes into your talk, and I leaned over to Nick and I was like, we need to ask Cassidy to come on the podcast. And because it was just so, it was straight away, it was just so interesting. And I think there's elements of, and we can get into it, but there's elements of the presentation you gave that are actually in every single person's life around like the Internet of Things, of home devices and all those kind of aspects. And they can be really positive and really good. And then you can also be like, use them for significant harm as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we go any further, we had one episode. Our last episode had no content warning because I made sure it didn't. But every other episode has had a content warning, and this one is no exception. So we will be discussing cyberstalking, which involves like quite abusive behavior, domestic abuse, domestic violence, coercive control, those kinds of things. And then the impact on victims as well, which can be psychologically quite traumatic. So if that is difficult for anyone, please take care of yourselves, or if you'd prefer to skip this episode, please do that. And we will put some resources in the show notes as well for anyone who wants to find out more or needs some mental health
Support.
Yep. Yes. We all need some mental health, but supports is the word I was looking for. So I suppose let's start with like what is cyberstalking, if we were to define it?
Sure. So I think what's important, first of all, is to understand the links between traditional stalking and cyberstalking. So within England and Wales, stalking is defined generally as any repeated unwanted behaviour that causes a victim to feel alarm or distress or fear of violence. And the key aspect that needs to be demonstrated legally is that there is a course of conduct of behaviour that amounts to stalking. So this means 2 or more incidents of this unwanted intrusive behaviour, and generally that needs to occur within a 6-month time frame. Most cases of stalking involve many, many more incidents than just 2, of course, but from a legal perspective that is the absolute bare minimum. Cyberstalking in England and Wales is not defined distinctly in the legislation to stalking. So stalking would be any repeated unwanted in-person behaviour that causes alarm, distress or fear. Cyberstalking would be any repeated unwanted online behaviour. that causes alarm, distress, or fear.
Yeah.
And
it has to be that they're aware of as well, I suppose. If it's a
Well, if it's
cyberstalking
causing
case,
fear, or distress, then they would have to be,
but
correct.
it's whether they're aware or not is also an important factor there too.
It is, absolutely. And that's even more relevant with cyberstalking, because through my research and through a lot of the literature that's out there, we know that there are a whole range of methods of cyberstalking that can occur without a victim's knowledge. And that really does bring into question if we require the victim to feel alarm, distress, or fear and to report those feelings. Are we excluding cases where actually there is a lot going on under the surface? So it's quite a unique offence in that the individual behaviours themselves aren't necessarily illegal. Sending someone repeated messages, looking at someone's location on Snapchat, these things aren't illegal on their own. It's when they are combined within that course of conduct and it has that impact on the victim, that's when it becomes illegal. And I think something else to point out as well is, whilst the definitions are very similar, some researchers, they include stalking and cyberstalking together as one. Other researchers tend to separate these out. In reality, what we see is that the vast, vast majority of cases involve both online and in-person behaviours. So the way that I tend to visualize it is a bit of a Venn diagram. You've got stalking on the left-hand side, cyberstalking on the right-hand side, but in the middle, that is where most cases fall. And I think it's unsurprising, really, if you are a perpetrator, you want to find every way you possibly can to cause that alarm, distress, or fear. And so you're going to employ as many methods as you possibly can.
Yeah. And even the amount of information that's available online assists if what you really want to do is in-person stalking. So you're going to be looking at people's profiles and their activity to see where they are, what they're doing, where they work, all those kinds of things. Or even things like Strava and where you normally run and what routes you take. And like there's so much information available now that makes it much easier, I suppose, to find people in person if that's what the intent is.
Or if it's particularly difficult to stalk that person in a face-to-face scenario, getting the same kind of psychological driver or reward system from gaining information from, whether it's just purely online information in like a Strava map and knowing what they're doing, or a camera in someone's home.
Yeah. So a lot of the behaviors that you're talking about, sending repeated messages, like I'm not stalking Liam, but we send each other repeated messages all the time. Tracking somebody's location, like a lot of couples do that with each other, and it's perfectly benign. There's so much of the behaviors that are quite neutral in different circumstances. And then there's a lot of the behaviors that could come across as positive. Like I've heard people's experiences of going to the police and saying, this person like keeps sending me gifts. And they're kind of like, well, aren't you lucky, you know? But maybe you can talk about how those kinds of behaviors affect people or how they add up when they look like neutral or positive kind of engagements, but aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a few points there to pick up on. I think, first of all, something, again, that is made quite clear when we're thinking about the legislation in relation to stalking and cyberstalking, and we're thinking about police responses, it needs to be absolutely clear that the situation is one-sided. So if you have two people who are monitoring each other's location, who are sending repeated messages to each other, who are monitoring each other's online activity, those things, if both people are involved, that would not come under stalking or cyberstalking. The intent is important, but also the impact is important. You know, we've discussed the fact that the victim has to feel this alarm, distress, or fear. And so that's really, really important to highlight in these cases. And the way that we measure that is important as well, asking victims how and why they are impacted. And I think, secondly, you mentioned, you know, a lot of these behaviours, they may be viewed positively. Wouldn't you want that kind of attention? Isn't it nice to receive those friendly messages? Isn't it nice to receive those gifts? And again, it picks up on the fact that actually a lot of these behaviours on their own are not necessarily that concerning, especially because for someone to perpetrate cyberstalking, the nature of the messages is actually irrelevant. Every single message they send could be perfectly pleasant, could be really complimentary, but actually it's the impact on the victim.
Yeah.
If that is unwanted, then that's where we become concerned and it crosses that boundary. The same with receiving gifts or receiving money, anything along those lines. It really is the wider context that matters there. We know that these kind of behaviours have huge impacts on victims. There's been some really interesting recent research that has categorised the impacts on victims of stalking and cyberstalking. We know that psychological impacts are the most common, so depression, anxiety, PTSD. There's also a phrase hypervigilance, which you may be familiar with. In the kind of stalking and cyberstalking support space, we tend to avoid using the word paranoia. Paranoia has some negative connotations sometimes. If someone is labelled as paranoid, you might not believe that what they are worried about is actually happening. And so we try to move away from that word, and instead that hypervigilance, and that's where that comes into play. So it's really constantly living on edge, looking over your shoulder, wondering who's nearby, wondering what's going to happen. We know that can have a huge impact on victims psychologically. You've then got the physical aspects. So cyberstalking and stalking victimization can actually have an impact on physical health. So it can affect a victim's sleep. It can affect their ability to look after themselves, to eat, to exercise. It can even cause them to be put onto medication if they're really struggling to manage the situation. And so it can actually have a really physical impact as well. And then the final two categories, you've got practical impact. So this is anything that the victim has to change about their life. So this could be they may need to change their routines. They may need to change the time of day that they go to work, the route that they take to work, the time that they pick up the children from school, all those kind of things. They may even need to move house if they really don't feel safe where they're currently living. They may also need to change, particularly with those cases involving the online behaviours, a lot about what they do online. So they may need to delete their social media accounts. They may need to remove certain apps from their phone. They may need to get a new phone if they think their device has been compromised in any way. And especially in the day and age that we live in, so much of our life obviously is tied to our phones. And if you have a job, for example, where you use your mobile number to contact clients, to keep in touch with people, that can have a huge impact on you personally, but also on your work as well. And then that final category, and this is something that came up in research quite recently, which I thought was really interesting, is actually impact on others around the victim. So this is children, family, partners, friends, colleagues. And this hadn't really been researched previously. And it was found that actually a lot of victims of stalking and cyberstalking report that the situation really does impact those around them. This can be directly from the perpetrator actually contacting the victim's family and friends, but also it can be indirectly as well. The victim, is going through this situation and they're having to reach out for support from family and friends, and this can really have an impact on others around them as well. So I think overall there's a good amount of research at the moment, and it's ongoing, into how detrimental cyberstalking can be. And that really helps to inform how we then can support victims and help people through this.
And a lot of what stands out for me is from the beginning of that, while you're talking, I'm like, the elements of things like paranoia, the change in language, there's a heavy element of and you both kind of said it. And I was like, even the way, imagine if a member of law enforcement said to you, well, oh, look at you. It's a very condescending, victim blaming approach to take. And then as you move through the different kind of paradigms, it's all the victim has to do something. The victim has to change their behavior. The victim has to, or the person who's being targeted has to change their elements of their identity, both online or offline. And it's not the onus on the other person who's a perpetrator.
Yeah. And even in terms of gathering evidence, the victim has to keep all the messages. They can't just delete them, get rid of them. They've got to be there as a resource for the police to use, which means that you always have it there to look at rather than being able to get rid of it and just kind of forget about it, and to be able to see the body of history of messages or whatever it is. I don't know if you listened to the podcast Stalked from the BBC. It was about Hannah Mossman Moore, Karen what's her name? Karen Cadwalder.
Oh, yeah.
Was the producer on it. She had been stalked by somebody that she had met in person who was actually pretending to be somebody else. So he was catfishing, but in person. And other people sort of knew him. So she thought within the London fashion scene that he was well known and he was somebody interesting. And she made friends with him. And he ended up stalking her, but also still talking to her at the same time, pretending it wasn't him. It's very, very strange. But one of the things that I took from it was the impact on the other people around you. You know, her parents felt bad. Maybe they'd given her too much freedom, or maybe they'd encouraged her to do too much stuff, because she was like in her 20s when it happened. Her partner at the time, that relationship was really impacted because this person was sending photographs of the two of them, and it just made things really, really difficult. It made her withdraw from all of her friends. She didn't know who to trust. She didn't know who was doing this. And that impact, that not having social support anymore, is hugely, hugely problematic.
She's completely isolated.
Yeah. And then some people just won't be believed either. You know, they'll think you did something, or there'll be some victim blaming. So I can see that having a really substantial impact.
Yeah.
There were a couple of other things that you said that kind of made me think. So the one about social media and having to change your behavior, and obviously that's problematic if you've got like a lot of friends on a platform. But if that's your work, and you have followers, like many, many followers, having to change that is really, really difficult, and it might impact your income and all sorts of stuff like that as well. But one thing that you said a little while back was about intent. And I think that's really interesting, because I don't know whether this is the case, but are some stalkers delusional in that they think that this is wanted behavior? And so they think they're doing something romantic and lovely, and they're just pursuing their love interest, but the person on the other end isn't interested.
Yeah, absolutely. There's various different motivations for stalking and cyberstalking. And again, I think this is why it's such a complicated offence. It's such a complex crime to research and to investigate and to experience, because not only are the methods through which it's done so varied, but also there can be so many different motivations behind it. Essentially, motivations can be grouped into 5 categories. So this was Mullen et al. In 1999 who came up with this typology. It's the most commonly referenced motivational typology of stalking perpetrators. Some of my research investigated whether these motivational groups could be applied to cyberstalking perpetrators. And I generally found that yes, they could. And it can be quite helpful to look at these motivations to understand, first of all, why perpetrators conduct this kind of behaviour, but also whether we can then predict future behaviours based on the motivational group. So you mentioned that some stalking perpetrators may be delusional. They may actually believe that what they're doing is going to encourage the victim to get back with them, and that is absolutely the case. So the first motivational group, rejected. So these are individuals who have been in a relationship with the victim, the relationship has broken down, they then target the victim, and their motivation can actually switch between reconciliation and revenge. It can go back and forth between the two, it can involve just one, but essentially they will target the victim after the breakdown of the relationship, and the stalking or cyberstalking that they are engaged in replaces the relationship that they had with the victim. And these cases tend to go on for quite a long time. They tend to be intense. And this is the most common motivational group that we see. I think...
Yeah. So it's basically the stalker's way of continuing the relationship on their side.
Exactly. Yeah. There is a little bit of a misconception, which I do think is improving in recent times, but there's a bit of a misconception that stalking especially, but cyberstalking as well, is often conducted by a stranger. It's someone hiding in the bushes. It's someone following you home. And actually, we see most often it's conducted by an ex-partner. And so that group is a really, really important group to look at. And they do often have delusional beliefs. They do often believe that the result of their behavior will be that they can reconcile with the victim and continue their relationship where they left off. The other motivational groups, you've got the resentful perpetrators. So these perpetrators, they perceive themselves to be the victim of an injustice, and they target the individual who they believe was the cause of that injustice. Resentful and rejected perpetrators do have similarities, particularly those that are targeting the victim for revenge. So resentful perpetrators, they believe that they were done wrong. This is why they're targeting the victim. This can be quite an intense form of stalking and cyberstalking perpetration, and they will keep going until they believe that the victim has paid for what they've done, essentially.
So what kind of things would that involve? Like, someone, maybe they asked somebody out and they said no, or they expressed interest and somebody wasn't interested, those kinds of things, or is it broader than that?
So resentful can be quite broad, and actually I think this is quite an interesting group because it can include individuals who are targeting more than one victim. A good example of this is someone who perhaps was fired and they believe they were wrongfully fired. They may then target their old boss. They may send letters, they may send emails, they may turn up at the workplace because they believe that they were done wrong, they were the victim of this injustice. If that doesn't get them anywhere, they may actually then move on to someone else within the company. So maybe they would go up the ladder, they would move on to someone in the corporate office, for example. And again, if that doesn't get them anywhere, they might move on to their local MP and get them involved. And so this group, whilst they have one particular target, they might actually move from victim to victim if they don't believe that their efforts are achieving what they want them to achieve.
Okay, that's really interesting.
But it's good because it differentiates out between this romantic aspect to stalking and cyberstalking that we often see, and then moving to obviously this kind of seeking justice mentality as well.
It's interesting how much perceived injustice can drive a lot of negative behavior. You see the same thing in radicalization. The first step in radicalization is a sense of perceived or real injustice, but it doesn't have to be real at all. And I imagine in this case, it's perceived injustice as well. It doesn't have to be real either.
Correct. Yeah, it can be either. There are cases where someone was genuinely fired and they believe that they were fired for the wrong reasons. But we've also had cases where, they've essentially created this scenario, in their head, and they've targeted, from our perspective, would be someone random, but from their perspective, that is the person that's caused them this upset.
Yeah. Yeah, so they've created their own story.
Well, they've fully rationalized it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you've got the next group of perpetrators. So these are labeled as intimacy seekers. So these perpetrators target a victim in order to establish a relationship with them. So usually the perpetrator and the victim have met. They have met completely outside of a romantic context. The perpetrator has then come to believe that the victim is their one true love and they are destined to be with this victim. They will then stalk or cyberstalk the victim in an effort to establish that relationship. Sometimes we see this, for example, with an individual who went into a shop. They were helped by a shop assistant, and they have then taken that as a sign that they are meant to be with this person. They're meant to establish a relationship with them. And these individuals will often stalk or cyberstalk for quite a long time. They will keep going and stick to this same victim because they do believe that is their destiny to be with this person. And then the fourth group is the incompetent suitor perpetrator. And there are a couple of similarities with intimacy seeker in that the context is similar. So this person is aiming to establish a romantic connection. The key difference between the two groups is the incompetent suitors generally are seeking a sexual encounter with the victim rather than a relationship. They don't necessarily believe that they are destined to be with the victim, but they would like to have a sexual or romantic encounter with the victim. These perpetrators, they can be quite intense. They may lack understanding of the typical dating rituals that a reasonable person would engage in. But also, if their efforts aren't reciprocated, they may move on to someone else. So unlike the intimacy seekers, they don't tend to stalk for long periods of time.
Okay.
They will move on if they are not achieving what they want to achieve. And then the final group is the predatory group. This is the smallest group generally in terms of prevalence, but predatory perpetrators of stalking or cyberstalking are targeting the victim in preparation for a sexual or physical attack of the victim. These cases are more common in stalking really than cyberstalking, because the perpetrator is physically conducting surveillance of the victim, they're planning an attack of the victim. These cases are rare. Usually the perpetrator and the victim in these instances are strangers, they're not known to each other, and it's not always fully known why the perpetrator has identified that victim and targeted them. But they will engage in surveillance, they'll engage in monitoring in preparation for an attack.
So the intimacy seekers kind of remind me the behaviors we spoke about in online dating. So we talk about like someone who works in hospitality or works in retail and they're being paid to be nice and be helpful, and men misconstruing that person being nice for, oh, that person's attracted to me and I now need to escalate far beyond what I should be doing.
Well, men tend to overread those signals of friendliness as attraction, whereas women tend to underread them. As you were talking about those intimacy seekers, I wrote gender ? Because I was wondering, is there, in any of these categories, is there a gender difference? Is there gender difference across cyberstalking overall? Or does it depend on the motivation of the stalker?
So generally we see that perpetrators are more likely to be male and victims more likely to be female. It's pretty much in line with most domestic abuse cases, violent offences, things like that. There is some research to suggest that actually cyberstalking can sometimes be more likely to be committed by a female perpetrator. And I think it's interesting because, as with many of the online offences, if not most of them, your gender and your physical capabilities, your physical appearance actually doesn't play a huge role. Going back to that definition, you can cause quite significant alarm, distress, or fear without actually being very physically aggressive or physically violent. And so whilst we do still see that the vast majority of cases involve a male perpetrator and female victim, sometimes in cyberstalking, this can give female perpetrators an avenue to really have a huge impact. In terms of within the motivational groups, there doesn't tend to be a huge difference. Predatory is almost always male, but within the other groups, it doesn't vary too much. The only other difference is sometimes within the incompetent suitor group, you may have perpetrators who have learning differences or mental health difficulties. And again, that links back to not necessarily having a full understanding of how one would typically date in society.
So not reading social cues and that kind of stuff. Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. I'm surprised about the lack of a gender difference within the other groups, although if it's more male overall, then that makes sense, I suppose, to me. One of the questions I was going to ask you was, is there any group that is more likely to commit violence? Now, obviously, when you got to the predatory group, I was like, well, clearly that one. But out of the other groups, is there, because one of the things that I suppose people are fearful of is they don't know where this is going to go. We've heard news stories about stalking, and particularly with ex-intimate partners, about stalking ending in violence or murder. And so if this is happening to you, you might fear that this is where it's going. Is it more likely in some groups or from some motivations than others, or is that someone who's just a different kind of person?
Yeah, so again, I think there's kind of two ways of looking at this. So in the original study back in 1999, when they created these groups, they proposed that perpetrators who fell into the rejected or resentful categories were more likely to be violent. The predatory category, there's a slight caveat there, because during the stalking itself, they're unlikely to be violent, but at the end, there is then a likelihood of a violent or sexual attack. Within the stalking course of conduct, the rejected and resentful perpetrators may be violent towards the victim, especially when that revenge and resentment and hatred comes into play. Having said that, my research, when I looked at these groups, I took a large sample of cases of stalking and cyberstalking, and I categorized them according to these motivational groups, and then I had a look at whether violence differed between the groups, and actually there weren't huge differences. So I think what's important to remember when we're talking about these groups is it can be really helpful for a victim to understand why a perpetrator might be engaging in these behaviors. But what we shouldn't be doing is using these groups to predict future behaviors or risk of harm. This is not a risk assessment or risk screening tool. There are lots of risk assessment tools available, some of which have a lot more research than others, and that's ongoing. But we shouldn't be using these to predict risk of future harm or violence. But they can give sometimes they can give victims a better idea of why they are in this situation.
Yeah. I imagine, like, with an ex-intimate partner, like, it's a bit more obvious maybe why, that it's either revenge or control maybe, or wanting to get back together. With someone that you don't know, or that you only know a little, who turns to this kind of behavior, that would be much more confusing, like why somebody is engaging in this.
But see, that's what I was thinking. While you're talking, I'm thinking the impact or the role of like media's portrayal. So like the cases of stalking or cyberstalking we see are the predatory, violent formats. And then more recently, I'm pretty sure it's Baby Reindeer, isn't it? The Netflix series. Like that starts in those kind of resentful behaviors. The person is an intimacy seeker at the beginning and then starts to move through to like a more violent form of stalking. And it is both a in-person stalking and an online. Do you think that starts to have an impact on public awareness of stalking behavior? And as a researcher, is it an accurate portrayal?
So Baby Reindeer brings a few thoughts to mind. I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea to depict stalking and cyberstalking in the media, because the more awareness we have, the better we are going to be equipped to deal with it, especially for victims. If someone is watching that and thinking, actually, do you know what, I'm seeing a few similarities here with what I'm experiencing, then that's never a bad thing. I think the biggest issue with Baby Reindeer is how similar the portrayal was to the real case. And what you are essentially doing is throwing a spotlight on someone who is desperate for attention, who is delusional, who has clearly targeted the victim through a course of conduct of stalking and cyberstalking. You are giving them almost exactly what they want. And so I think it was an interesting depiction because it did demonstrate that victims aren't perfect. Sometimes victims react in different ways. They may re-engage in contact with the perpetrator. They may approach the perpetrator. They may have different reactions to the situation. And so I think that was quite important. However, I think the real life consequences maybe weren't fully considered. And we saw in another series that comes to mind is You on Netflix as well. That was kind of semi-recent, and again that kind of depicted these stalking behaviors, and that one's obviously a fictional, a little bit more far-fetched, but I think in general, we are seeing accurate depictions to an extent. We then have to consider, is this going to help victims, or is this actually going to give publicity to the people that it shouldn't?
Yeah.
The kind of glorification aspect of it, or attention.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like how mass shootings are reported, that there's always so much focus on the victim and who they were and what a surprise it was because they were such a family man and those kinds of things, rather than on the victims of the crime. Or the same with a lot of domestic murders, particularly family annihilation. In Ireland, in the press, it's always about the man. And well, he was played GAA and involved in the local community and always showed up at church, and he's just killed like his wife and 3 children. So it feels a bit like that to me, like the attention's in the wrong place when it's done badly.
But they're the cases that become quite high profile. They are naturally going to get a lot more attention, and our perceptions of stalking or cyberstalking are on a much more extreme scale than potentially what are the more prevalent cases of either an immediate past intimate relationship that has gone wrong where the person can try to continue that relationship, or the kind of justice seeking ones as well.
Yeah. There's been a couple of cases recently which I'm finding hard to fit into the categories. Do you come across many that span categories or that just don't fit within those at all?
Yeah, we do. We definitely do. There are sometimes cases where the perpetrator has quite significant mental health difficulties or mental health disorders. They often don't fit into a category very neatly. You can also have cases that span a couple of different categories, again, particularly between that rejected and resentful groups. And it's certainly not a perfect approach to categorizing cases. I actually found in my research it can sometimes be more useful to categorize cases depending on the extent of online behaviors involved. So you have cases that are exclusively offline. There's no cyber element at all. You've got those cases that have an online and an offline element. And then you have the exclusively cyberstalking cases that occur just online. My research found that was the most kind of natural way of grouping the cases. And I think we don't yet know what the implications of that might be. We don't yet know what the utility of that might be for police or for victim supporters or for further research. But I think it's interesting that that's what separates them rather than those motivations. I found that they could be grouped by motivation the vast majority of the time. But again, it didn't necessarily predict things. So it has pros and cons at the end of the day.
Yeah. Did you find grouping them according to how they stalked, whether it was online, mixed, or offline, that there were particular characteristics of those groups at all?
So my research was based more on information from the victims. So we were lacking the kind of more detail about the perpetrators, and hopefully going forward, that is definitely something I'd like to look at, because back when I started my research and I began the PhD, that was one of my key thoughts was, surely someone who is perpetrating this in person, they differ quite a lot from someone who's perpetrating this just online. You know, we know that the victims may differ, we know that the methods differ, but actually, can we identify how these perpetrators differ? So I think it's a really interesting area for research.
Yeah, because like with a lot of things, it feels like there's a lot more risk to going out in person following someone than just sending emails. You can feel like you're more anonymous and safer that way. They can't see who you really are. So you've maybe got that online disinhibition effect. Someone who would never stalk in person maybe starts stalking online.
Absolutely, yeah.
And maybe then progresses. Like, it's hard to know, isn't it? Yeah, it's quite interesting. You talked about violence, and when we say violence, we usually mean physical violence, but there's other ways of kind of committing violent acts against people. Like destroying somebody's life is quite a violent act, even if you don't physically go near them. And I'm thinking about things like, destroying somebody's reputation, which seems to be something that I've seen in various stories, like the podcast Stalked with Hannah in it. The stalker was calling her places of work, and she actually didn't find out for ages. But calling and either pretending to be her or calling about her and saying she'd done all these things and trying to ruin her reputation that way. Is that something else? Like, what kinds of methods are being used to target victims other than the ones that we kind of obviously think about, which is following somebody, sending emails to them, maybe sending gifts?
Yeah, so vexatious complaints or, spreading false information is something we see an awful lot. And this can often be as a result of the victim not reciprocating contact, first of all. So the perpetrator may target the victim initially, send them messages, emails, letters, however they wish to do it. If that's not reciprocated, they may then contact family and friends. They may then contact work. They may start to be posting about the victim online. And so you kind of have that move from direct to indirect. When it comes to cyberstalking, I think the easiest way to kind of group the methods is online contact, online posting, online monitoring, and then accessing accounts. So you've got those 4 groups. Online contact, obviously, that can include messages, emails, direct contact, but also invites to online groups, things like that. Online posting is a little bit more public. So this is when the perpetrator might actually make posts about the victim. They might post photos of the victim online. They might post in groups that they know that the victim is in. And obviously a lot of this, if not all of it, is occurring through social media. You then have online monitoring. So this may be monitoring the victim's online activity if they're able to do so, maybe monitoring their live location or their tagged locations. You mentioned something like Strava. That's a perfect example of an app that is designed to be productive and completely harmless and actually can clearly show people your exact route that you go on a run, where you start, where you finish, the time, who you go with, and you're giving all this information away, and you don't always know who can see that. So that's a big part of it as well. And then the final group, accessing. So accessing the victim's email accounts, social media accounts, online shopping accounts as well. And you kind of, within those 4 groups, you've almost got 2 categories there. So you've got the more overt methods, which would be the contact and the posting. And then you've got the slightly more covert methods, which would be the monitoring and the accessing. And it links back to something we said towards the beginning as well, which was, how do we know all the behaviors that are occurring? If you imagine, the tip of the iceberg, you can see those overt behaviors. That's what the victim is aware of. What's going on beneath the surface? Have we got all of these covert behaviors happening? And importantly, if the victim was aware of them, would it cause them alarm, distress, or fear? I'm sure the answer is probably yes. So,
like if you knew somebody was checking all of your social media and any other information about you online every single day, multiple times a day, but you never knew they were.
Yeah.
And you found out they've been doing this for 6 months. Like, I would be kind of
pretty distressed,
freaked out by that.
Yeah.
This is what I was going to ask is, like, what are the issues? I have my research methods head back on. So, like, what are the issues with actually collecting this data? But from like people who are perpetrating, but also people who've been victims. Like, are there any barriers to reporting and accurate results? And you've kind of spoken so far around ex-partners, but a lot of the access to this information is also current partners.
Yeah, and that's an important point, because particularly with the accessing online accounts or online monitoring, we see a lot of cases where the victim and perpetrator were in a relationship. They have set up smart home devices in their house. The relationship has broken down. The perpetrator moves out, but they still have access to those smart home devices. So they can see what you are saying to your smart speaker. They can see when you change the temperature in your house. They maybe can see your camera doorbell. And we also see it in cases with children involved. So if the perpetrator and victim have a child, they have shared custody, they can use the child's iPad, tablet, phone to monitor what the other person is doing. And so there's definitely elements of stalking and cyberstalking that actually can be set up during a relationship. And whilst if it occurs during the relationship, it would come under domestic abuse or coercive control or potentially malicious communications. Once that relationship has broken down, that then crosses the barrier into stalking or cyberstalking. So a lot of these methods, they can be set up quite covertly and also quite harmlessly. Initially, when you set up the smart device, you probably weren't imagining that it was going to be used in a negative way in the future.
To do that,
Yeah, but it just shows that
like
actually
you
they
wouldn't be
can.
thinking that your thermostat would be giving away useful information, but of course it tells somebody when you're home or not.
Yeah.
Or it can be used remotely to change the temperature on you.
or devices in your house.
Yeah.
To like mess with someone, interrupting those changing TV channels. Like the technology is significantly advanced. So,
and even things like if you've set up a system on your router to, prevent your children looking at pornography and stuff, then you have a list of every single thing that everybody in the house is looking at. So you can monitor every bit of history online. And I imagine in coercive control cases, the perpetrator often will put something onto the victim's phone that keylogs and tracks everything they're doing. And that could still be there once that relationship is over as well, without them realizing.
Yeah, I mean, there's even adverts for stalker apps. They call themselves, they can be disguised as a calculator or something like that. And so, if a victim doesn't have a huge lot of technological experience, they may not check these things. I mean, on an iPhone, for example, an app can be hidden away in the kind of app archives. It doesn't need to appear on the home screen, and actually it can be running in the background the whole time. So there's huge issues. And again, it links back to Liam's question about how do we collect this data? How do we actually know what's happening? I was fortunate in my research that I had some really, really rich data from victims, which was obtained through the Stalking Helpline, Susie Lamplugh Trust, who I've worked with previously. But to get information from perpetrators, we know that perpetrators don't admit to their behaviours. They don't recognise the impact of their behaviours. And so that can cause significant issues if we are trying to understand stalking and cyberstalking better. And the other aspect to consider as well is from a police perspective. When they are trying to gather evidence, the victim can give them as much as possible, but once again, the responsibility is on the victim from the beginning. Yeah. It's the victim who has to recognise the impact. They have to feel the alarm, distress, or fear. They then have to recognise the methods that they are experiencing of stalking or cyberstalking. They have to keep a record. They have to take screenshots. They have to report to the police. And so much of the responsibility is on the victim that I am of the opinion once it is reported to the police, there really needs to be a push for the police to be able to improve their digital forensics to gather this kind of evidence, to make sure that we are looking at as much as possible.
Yeah, and to see the full scope of the behaviours, because the covert behaviours won't be seen by the victim. They won't know about those.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it could be much deeper than even the victim thinks. Yeah, it's so awful. Like I've listened to people's experiences of this, and it's just, whether you know the person or not, it really doesn't impact the level of terror that people feel, except that if you don't know them, you really don't know who it is. And so you never know if they're nearby or not. And you could be talking to them. It could be somebody you know. It could be somebody you don't know. And when they seem to know a lot about you, then you start to distrust everybody that you know because you don't know who it is. It's, it's really
the only
dark.
form of perpetrator reporting I can think of would be where they're seeking that, like, almost like within like hacking culture, they seek kind of praise or recognition or glory, like you spoke about earlier. That's the only cohort that might represent themselves in terms of coming forward.
And they're probably
afterwards.
not
and even then,
a representative sample of all stalkers, because the ones who are delusional and intimacy seeking don't think they're stalkers, right? They're like, this person is the one for me, and they're sending me, they might even interpret, and I've seen this with celebrity stalking, that message they put on Instagram was for me because they said this specific thing and it has meaning for me. And it was a symbol to represent our love. And, eventually we'll be together. So they're not going to talk about why they're stalking somebody because they don't think that they are. So yeah, I imagine collecting data from that side is very, very difficult.
What are the effective interventions? We've talked about like all of the horror. We need to move to...
Oh, I was going to ask about personality traits before we...
Okay.
Yeah? Is that okay? Do we know anything about who's more likely to become stalkers in terms of personality or types of people? And then we'll talk about intervention.
We have to move to happy at some point.
Well, that's if there are any.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit of research into kind of personality traits. It's not something personally that I've looked at, but there are some quite interesting findings. Generally, things like psychopathy don't tend to be significantly higher in stalking populations, but there are elements of narcissism that definitely come into play. And, we've talked about the similarities, for example, with domestic abuse and coercive control. And we know from research that, narcissistic traits tend to be quite prominent there. I think a lot of the time, though, it is context dependent. I think, yes, the personality traits, the previous experiences, they all do contribute. But I often think actually when someone is put in a scenario where they genuinely believe that they have been wronged, they genuinely believe that the relationship should not have ended, then I think almost anyone could resort to those behaviors if you have that belief. And obviously that links back to those kind of delusional perspectives as well. So anyone who is more susceptible to feeling that could be more likely to perpetrate. But we see, generally in the cases, these people can be very well adjusted. Perpetrators can have full-time jobs, they have families, they are seemingly adjusted to society, and then something happens and there's that flick of a switch, and suddenly they decide that that's what they need to do. So it really does vary.
Okay.
Interventions?
Yeah.
I have another couple of questions after that then. So we're not going to end on a high note.
But in terms of the different categories of stalking we've spoken about, the different motivations, is there a best practice approach for the individual to take, so the person who's being targeted? And again, this goes back to like onus on the person who's being targeted again, which isn't great. But then is there a best practice for enforcement as well?
Sure. So generally our advice to victims is in 3 stages. So step 1, which is really key, is to cease all contact with the perpetrator. Some victims and some individuals have a belief that I need to send them one final message. I need to say to them, look, leave me alone. I don't want to hear from you. And actually, by not responding, you are sending that message in itself. That is enough. And so we recommend against any contact with the perpetrator, first of all. The second step is to then start keeping a detailed record, a detailed log. So every single time something happens, writing down the date, the time, the location, any evidence you have. If it was physically in a public place, they came up to you, there may be CCTV. If it's online, you can take screenshots of comments, posts, messages, that kind of thing. Keeping a really detailed log can make the difference between securing an investigation and not. So it can be super, super important. And then that third stage is report to the police. We are seeing a slight improvement with how the police are dealing with stalking and cyberstalking cases. Historically, it's not been great. Some of my research looked at the criminal justice responses, and we are seeing improvements. But as a victim, if you are able to lay the foundations with a detailed log and clear evidence that you cut off contact, it's a one-sided situation, you put yourself in a much stronger position. From a legal perspective, there are a few options of what the police can actually do. We always hope that they will open an investigation. There's a few different options in terms of the legal ramifications. They can arrest the perpetrator and give them bail conditions. Bail conditions can prevent contact to the victim. They can enforce location restrictions as well. But breach of pre-charge bail conditions is not a criminal offence. And so whilst it can provide a little bit of short-term relief, it's not a long-term plan. What we would hope is that the police can continue their investigation and build up a strong log of evidence before hopefully charging the perpetrator with stalking. Something that came into play in late 2019 was a legal order called a stalking protection order. And these were introduced to hopefully give victims a quicker response to stalking and cyberstalking. So a stalking protection order can actually be applied for by the police whilst the investigation is still continuing. And this is key because with stalking and cyberstalking, this isn't an offence that happens one time and it's reported to the police and that's it. This is ongoing, and so the victim has to keep enduring that for as long as the investigation continues. So if there's something that can be put into place during that time, it's going to alleviate the impact on the victim.
Does that include cyberstalking behavior as well, or is it just stalking?
It does, yes. So stalking and cyberstalking, because they both come under that same legislation, they're not defined distinctly. They would both be included as long as it's that course of conduct of repeated unwanted behavior.
So with like things like hacking behavior, there's in bail conditions often there's like they're not allowed access to devices or there are restrictions in place there. Does that happen in cyberstalking cases too?
It can do, yes. They can enforce that the perpetrator actually give their devices to the police whilst the investigation continues. Not only...
I imagine there's forensic evidence on them as well.
Exactly,
so.
yeah. And, the benefit of that is twofold, because you can then gather the evidence, but also you're potentially stopping the perpetrator from continuing their online behaviours. And that's the benefit of stalking protection orders, is they place restrictions on the perpetrator, but also they have what are called positive requirements. So they can force the perpetrator to give their devices over, and they can also force the perpetrator to attend a mental health assessment or a behavioural intervention. And that's slightly different to the pre-existing orders, such as restraining orders or non-molestation orders. Those don't have positive requirements. So it was really beneficial to see these come into play in late 2019, 2020. They are still underused, but they have been reviewed and generally they are deemed as quite effective. I think now the priority is raising awareness of them. There are still a lot of police forces that don't use them, but they are really useful tools to not only stop the behaviours, but also protect the victims.
Yeah. And of course, they work when you know who the person stalking you is, but not if you don't know who it is. And so I imagine it's more difficult in those cases because trying to track somebody down is just incredibly difficult. Yeah. What is the recidivism rate? Like when people have been prosecuted and found guilty of stalking, what is the likelihood that they're going to do it again?
I think a lot of the time it can relate back to the context again and the motivation, because if they are arrested, perhaps they have a stalking protection order or restraining order, or in very rare cases a custodial sentence, they serve that time and they come out the other side. A lot of it is then dependent on, have those beliefs subsided? Have they actually been able to move on from the victim? We do see cases where perpetrators return to the victim. They target them again. They breach the restraining orders. They breach the stalking protection orders. But it really does depend on whether those beliefs have subsided. There is some upcoming and ongoing research into interventions to actually help perpetrators move on and deal with emotional situations in more productive ways. But these are still in the early stages. Stalking interventions are under-researched, underfunded, and so there's still a long way to go to actually ensure that these perpetrators don't return to stalking or cyberstalking.
Yeah. I don't know if you've come across a case in Scotland at all. It was very widely reported in the media there and down in the UK as well, or in England as well. And there's a recent BBC documentary actually just came out last weekend on it, where they talked to quite a few of the victims as well as like the mother and sister of the perpetrator. And it's a really unusual case. So I also contributed to the documentary, and it was like, it's being described as a catfishing case, but it's a catfishing and cyberstalking and stalking, offline stalking case. And it doesn't fit neatly anywhere in the categories for me. Are you aware of the case at all? Have you come across it?
I am a little bit, yeah. I read up a little bit about it, and I know that this was a really pervasive offender, wasn't she?
Yeah. So she committed like a number of offences and ended up the first set of offences, there were 18 offences, and she initially pled not guilty, but she eventually pled guilty to them. So Adele Rennie, the first time she was convicted, it was of 18 counts, 4 of indecent communication, 4 counts of sexual coercion, and 10 counts of stalking. So they did have a stalking crime.
Yeah.
What's the word I'm looking for? And she pled guilty to those. She was sentenced and served half the time and came out and didn't do anything for a little while. I think it was a couple of years. And then did exactly the same thing again. So she was creating male profiles and using a voice changing app to make her voice sound like a man. And she was communicating with women in her local area, not too far away at all. So she could actually go see them. And she frequently did, acting as somebody else. But a lot of online communication, a lot of phone calls, a lot of texting. And then when she acted as herself, she would pretend to be the florist delivering flowers or things like that. She also knew a lot of the women in real life, just casually through friends or through working with people. And so there was some connection there. She went back to jail. She's in jail at the moment for the 4th time. So every time she's come back out, like one of the last times she came out was within 3 days that she contacted one of her previous victims. And she doesn't seem to be able to stop. And before this, her mother had said she just didn't recognize that she'd done anything wrong. But now she seems to, or at least she's released a statement saying that she does and that they were innocent victims. As someone who appears to be a compulsive liar, it's hard to know whether or not that's actually the case. But I am interested in that. Like, it appears to be quite compulsive behavior for her because she knows she'll go back to prison. She's talked about how difficult it is being in prison and that she wouldn't survive it again, but then immediately did the same behavior in exactly the same way.
To the front door with a set of flowers.
Yeah. And didn't even change her approach so that it was immediately obvious to, like, the women who had initially been targeted had found out who she was. Like, they basically did their own investigation. They had their WhatsApp group together, and they were the ones who also discovered that she was continuing to do it. And she didn't change anything about her approach at all. So it was immediately obvious to them. It was exactly the same step-by-step process. And I'm just curious, like, what you think or what might the motivations or the driving behavior of someone like that be?
Yeah, I think to me that comes across as an addiction, essentially. It's that fixation with doing it. You said yourself, she knows she's just come out of prison. She's breaching the restraining order. She knows she's going to go straight back in there and she still can't help herself. And whether she is delusional or whether she knows exactly what she's doing probably remains to be seen. But to me, there is almost an element of addiction there. She is obsessed and fixated with this kind of behavior. And because she's had so many victims as well, she almost doesn't really care who the victim is, and that's why it doesn't necessarily neatly fit into any of those categories. And we do see cases like this. But yeah, it's also demonstrates that a female perpetrator can have, such a huge impact. Not all the cases fit this kind of male perpetrator, female victim category. And, it goes to show that it can be really, really pervasive and ongoing. And with someone like that, the question really is will she stop and how do we get her to stop? Is she going to be open to some kind of behavioral intervention, or really is it just going to be a continuous cycle of breaches and custodial sentences again? It's hard to know.
Yeah, because it's obviously meeting some needs that she has in some way, and unless she can find a way to meet those needs in other healthier ways, then that's going to be unmet. And like, even the time she was out for, I think it was maybe 4 years she was out. And then did it again. Like, that's quite a long period to have not done it, but maybe there was a stressor then that made her go back to that and to meet her needs or something.
Or were they aware that, or did she?
Or maybe there were people she didn't know. Yeah, it's hard to know. Yeah, I think it's interesting because it doesn't fit. Like, it has an element of that intimacy seeking. Like, all of the people she contacted were women. There was lots of sexual conversations. Some of them she was super lovely to and sent gifts to and was very complimentary. Others she was really debasing, degrading, insulting. It felt very much like coercive control. So it wasn't even, acting out one aspect of personality that you couldn't otherwise or anything like that.
There's no consistent motivation there.
It's hard to tell what it is. Yeah. It's an unusual case.
Yeah.
Very. And she was young and well-liked offline. She wasn't like a loner or unliked by other people. So it wasn't that either. It's just really an interesting one.
But are they stereotypes in cyberstalking or stalking cases that this person has to be aloof or a loner or these...
Or are they unsuccessful just socially.
Yeah, or are they just like a normal person who... No, I'm not going to say snaps, but like they there's a change, or there's a life event that changes their behavior.
Yeah, they can have lived a perfectly normal life. Not necessarily any kind of childhood traumas. They can live a comfortable life. They can have a stable family, stable finances. But really, if that breakdown of the relationship happens, or that perceived injustice happens, that can just be that trigger. And I think that's why the context is so important, because it's not one size fits all. It's not a certain type of person. It really does come down to the wider situation and the situation that they then put themselves in.
Yeah. We've seen with the advance of different technologies how they can be used in stalking. So we've talked about, smart homes and all of those kind of things. What do you see happening in the future with different technologies?
So I think the biggest concern that I have at the moment is, the absolute explosion of AI. We know it's happening. It's been happening for the last few years. And I know a lot of researchers are having to now kind of incorporate it into their ongoing research. There was a case that emerged, I believe it was late 2024, early 2025, over in the US. This was a case of cyberstalking that actually had been going on many, many years with many different victims. But what this perpetrator had done was, at one point, he was targeting a professor at a university, and he gathered personal information about her. And he actually designed an AI chatbot. He fed the information into this AI chatbot. And he then uploaded this chatbot onto a public website. So people would go onto this website, they would use this chatbot, and it would impersonate the victim and give out her private information, including...
I remember reading about this. Yeah.
It was shocking. It was down to her address, her work address, her date of birth, all these kind of things. And it would even encourage the users to visit her. And it just goes to show that as soon as we think we've caught up, something else comes along, that a new method comes along. And I think it sheds a lot of light on potentially where cyberstalking perpetration can go next. Alongside AI chatbots, I imagine that there's going to be a whole influx of other technologies that just make this offence, so much more pervasive.
I'm thinking like even with Grok and
it's just thinking nudifying,
nudifying, unconsensual nudifying, and even the creation of child sexual abuse materials. I listened to a podcast yesterday about a woman who had these images created of her, but they'd gone back. She grew up online. They'd gone back and found her when she was 14 and created the nude images and put her in different poses and covered her in various liquids. And that's child sexual abuse material of yourself that you're seeing. Yeah. And that's so degrading. And so people feel very humiliated by it. Particularly people in the public eye, are often targets of this. And at the moment, there's just thousands of images being generated a day of this kind of stuff. And I can see how that could be used for reputational damage, to upset and cause somebody quite extreme distress if that's your purpose in the stalking. Like so many of these things, like Grok being able to do that, it's so immediately obvious to women what was going to be the first thing that was done with something like that. And yet these platforms roll them out with no guardrails for that kind of thing at all.
But even that particular, the guy making the chatbot, encouraging people to visit, it's almost like this voyeuristic level of stalking behavior as well. So it's adding an additional layer of both harm and like the kind of characteristics to define it as stalking or cyber stalking, and then the level of psychological trauma of that would be even further. Never mind the person who the chatbot is designed about interacting with it themselves.
But it also makes me think of that case that we had in Ireland not very long ago, because it was about giving information about a victim to other people that could potentially cause the victim harm. So it wasn't necessarily, well, it was kind of stalking. So basically it was a case where there were two police who worked together, a man and a woman. Like they were friendly, they were actually friends. The woman did not know that it was the man doing this, but he put her information on a website designed for various different kinds of sexual kinks, one of which is consensual non-consent. So setting up an arrangement with your consent to pretend to be raped or sexually assaulted. But he was doing this on her behalf, pretending to be her. He put up photographs of her car, her number,
geolocation, where her kids went to school, the age of her kids,
who were teenage girls,
Google Maps of her street view. There was a lot of information, but then he also created this. He would then interact with her, and then I suppose within that community, one of the people contacted her off the website, found her on Facebook, and basically was like, "Is this you? I want to re-verify this and actual, like, get almost like 2FA consent."
Thankfully.
And she was like, "No, it's not." She eventually set up her own profile, interacted with that profile to figure out who it was, and basically investigated it herself, and then actually went to try and get it prosecuted, which she did.
Yeah, it was quite difficult because no physical crime had been committed. He hadn't physically hurt her. He hadn't necessarily stalked her because he knew her and they were friends, and no one had gone and physically hurt her yet, but there was definitely the potential. He had two or three people that he was talking to, setting it up as though he was her.
But it wasn't just harm against her, it was harm against her and her two
children.
daughters.
Yeah.
Do you know what he was charged with in the end?
He was charged with inciting other people to commit rape. He was charged with endangerment as well, so 6 counts of endangerment, and also with possession of child sexual abuse material. So he was actually sentenced to 8 years in prison with the last year suspended, which, when you consider the trauma of the idea of your self being put on one of these websites and your colleague who you thought was a friend arranging for people to rape you and potentially your daughters, doesn't seem like terribly long, because he'll probably be out in 4.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when these cases happen, they often refer to like the reputation of the person who was involved. So they're an upstanding member of society, particularly if they're a member of the police or someone who's substantial in a local community, and that starts to have an impact on issues around sentencing.
I think in this case, though, the judge actually said that as an upstanding member of the community, as someone who was supposed to be, protecting people, it actually makes it worse that you weren't, that you were inciting this. Yeah. So it was one of the times where it actually maybe made a difference. Do we have a final thing that we want to say?
I think we should probably wrap with support services.
In Ireland, Women's Aid offer support for victims of stalking, but there's also a website, stalkinginIreland.ie, that offers supports as well. And of course, you can call the Crime Victims Helpline here as well. We want to actually mention them in the website as well, but the resources on the show notes, because it's such an important thing, and maybe someone listening to this has realized that they're actually experiencing this and will know where to go.
Yeah. Cassidy, are there any particular ones in the UK you'd like to mention?
Yeah, so the biggest helpline in the UK is the National Stalking Helpline, a helpline that I have worked on in the past. I know the work they're doing is super, super important. And that can be found online through the Susie Lamplugh Trust, and the Alice Ruggles Trust as well offers support to victims of stalking and cyberstalking.
Okay. Excellent. We'll put those into the show notes as well. Cassidy, thank you. Sorry, Dr. Weeks, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and chatting to us about this. You have a depth of knowledge that neither of us has about it. So we really, really appreciate you bringing your expertise here and talking about it like so clearly and making it so concrete for people so that they can fully understand, what's going on in these situations and the different ways that it can present.
Yeah, I think it's really practical, and it takes the
mystery
out of it. I think is really important that this is so out there and outlandish when it actually can be related back to people as well.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you for having me.
Okay.
You're
very welcome. You've been listening to In Bits, the podcast that deconstructs our digital lives. I am Nicola Fox-Hamilton.
And I'm Liam Challoner.
You can find us on social media on Blue Sky,
Instagram, TikTok,
and YouTube. I can never remember.
At InBits Podcast. We'd like to hear from you. So if you would like to know more, or if there's particular topics that you have in mind that you think are interesting, please do reach out and we will do our best to focus on those for you.
This episode was produced and edited by the wonderful Owen Hurley. And thank you also to Owen for our music, for our theme tune.
We will be back in 2 weeks' time. So we will see you then.
See you then.
Thank you very much.
Bye.